Hello and welcome to this first tutorial, which is being organized as part of the Children as Creators of Augmented Reality Stories Erasmus Plus project. My name is Lawrence. I am an academic at the University of Malta, which is a partner organization taking part in this project. Today's first tutorial aims to provide a general familiarization to augmented reality authoring. In essence, we have three objectives for today's tutorial. The first objective is to recognize what is augmented reality and what the technology entails, identify what are different approaches to creating an augmented reality story. This is an essential aspect of our Erasmus Plus project. And finally, to provide some general familiarization with an augmented reality authoring platform. So before proceeding any further, we should really define what is augmented reality. In its essence, augmented reality, or AR, is a technology which superimposes digital information such as text, images, 3D models onto the real world. When making reference to augmented reality, this should not be confused with virtual reality. Although the two technologies may seem quite similar, they form part of what is called mixed reality, and are quite distinct from each other. So when we refer to virtual reality, typically in VR, the user is completely immersed into a three-dimensional experience. As you will notice, very often users would be wearing a headset in order to immerse them completely in a digital realm. In augmented reality, however, you will notice that users will typically make use of camera-enabled devices, such as, for example, a smartphone or a tablet or even a computer, which has a webcam attached to it, and this enables for the user to view the real world while also viewing digital models or information being superimposed onto the real world. An important aim of this project is to create an augmented reality story. There are really two approaches that one may take in order to create such a story. The first approach is to use a graphical user interface-based augmented reality authoring software, where essentially one would point and click in order to interact with different digital elements. The other approach is to use a coding language. Now, this last approach requires some knowledge of programming as well as familiarity with a coding language. And for this reason, in this project, we are going to focus on a graphical user interface-based approach to creating an augmented reality story. Now, what is an augmented reality authoring platform? In today's tutorial, we are going to provide an introduction to introduce an AR platform. But what is this? Well, think about the last time that you wrote a story, or that maybe you wrote an essay or a report. Typically, to do this, you would make use of certain tools, maybe a pen and paper, or most likely you would make use of software, such as a word processing software. Well, in the same way, in order to create an augmented reality story, one would make use of what is called an augmented reality authoring platform. In our case, we are going to use a graphical user interface-based platform. And one of the platforms, or the main platform that we are going to use throughout this project in order to create an AR story, is called ZapWorks. It should be noted that this is not the only augmented reality authoring platform that exists. However, for the purpose of this project, this is the platform, the authoring platform that we are going to make use. A link to this is provided here. So this is the website for ZapWorks. What I'm going to do, I am going to log in to my account, okay, using the credentials that I have available. And here we can see the landing page of ZapWorks. So first of all, you can see 4 files. These would have been files which have been created by yourself or your students. It is important to note, and this is particularly useful for those who would be working in teams or in schools, that you can add or invite other users. In order to do this, you can go on Team, and essentially you can add either educators or students. So as you can see, there are 2 main seats or types of seats that are available. If you want to add a student, all you need to do is simply click on Add Students and input their email address, and then subsequently the students that have been added will receive an invitation through their mailbox. Also, there is another type of user which are educators. So what are the main differences between the two? Essentially, educators have the ability to view the projects that have been created by all students, whereas students by default can only view the projects or the AR stories that they have created. So I'm going to click back and go back to projects. As you can see, we have 4 projects, but for the purpose of this tutorial, we're going to create a new project by simply clicking on the plus icon here on New Project. And what we are presented with is to select the software or method through which we are going to create our AR story. By default, and I strongly suggest that we use the designer. Why? Because the designer is a web-based platform, and this means that students and teachers are not required to download and install any software. Everything in the designer will be done and carried out through a website. So essentially, for using the designers, all you need is to have a good internet connection and also a web browser installed on your machine. So I'm going to use the designer and click on Select and Continue. And here we are presented with, let's call it a setup page, where essentially we are going to start to set up our story. So the first thing that we're going to do is click on Untitled Project, and what we're going to do is to allocate a name to our story. So in our case, I'm going to name this Cars Tutorial 1, which is the name of our story. If we wish, we can add things like logos in here. So I can go on my desktop. I can find, for example, a banner of the project and upload it as part of the cover sheet, let's say, of our augmented reality story. And for the time being, I would like to direct your attention towards this section, which is called triggers. What are triggers? Essentially, triggers are the means through which users can share their augmented reality story. As you can see, by default, we have a trigger here, which is a QR code, which can be downloaded in either PNG or SVG. However, you will also notice that we have the ability to add additional triggers, or types of triggers rather. So if I click on a new trigger, you will notice that we have the first option, which we already have, which is to add a QR code. The second option is called a deep link, and this basically entails a web address that users can share on their mobile devices in order to share their story. The third approach is to create an iframe, which can be embedded into a website. The fourth and last option is to have what is called a zap code. However, in order to use this zap code, which works quite similar to a QR code, in order to use a zap code, you would need to download an app on your Android or iOS device. The QR code and the deep link do not require any additional downloads. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to select deep link, I'm going to click on create. And as you will see, in addition to the QR code, which we had originally, now we have a second method to share our story, which is this web address that you can see here. So essentially, users can, or creators of this story, can either share this link in order for other users to view the AR story, or alternatively, they can make use of the QR code here in order to share their story. Now, at the very bottom of this page, okay, you will find what are called analytics, where basically you will see viewers, the number of views that we have in the last 7 days, total number of views, and also countries from where users accessed this story. Of course, for the time being, we do not have any viewers because we are still in the process of creating a story. We can also add an icon to our project or AR story, and of course we can use the project, the logo of the Cars project, which is here. So this is the basic setup, okay, for creating our story. The next step, once we have set up this page, is to click on Open Designer. So I'm going to click on Open Designer, and we are presented, okay, with first of all, the type of device that we wish to use. In our case, we're going to use a handheld device, which is going to be used. A handheld device can be a smartphone, or even a tablet, or even a laptop which has a camera attached to it. I'm going to click on Start Creating, and you will notice here that we have 4 additional options. So what are these 4 options? So this is called tracking. What is tracking? Essentially, tracking is the means through which the digital objects that we are going to add in our story are going to be overlaid onto the real world. And as you will notice, there are 4 main methods for tracking. The first method is called world tracking. This is by far the simplest tracking approach. Why? Because what the user will be required to do is, at the beginning of launching the AR story, the user will be asked to scan and place the scene of the story, the first scene of the story, onto a flat surface. A flat surface can be a table or a floor, and essentially this is all the user would need to do. With the second approach, which is image tracking, things become slightly more complicated, let's say. Why? Because with image tracking, the user would need to scan a specific image. Now, this is ideal, for instance, if we are going to print the story into a leaflet or a booklet, and we want specific scenes or specific pictures in our storybook to correspond to a specific augmented reality scene. In terms of what we have to do in order to create an image-tracked story or scene, we would need to create the assets, and in addition to this, we also would need to provide the image that the user would scan. So we need to upload a specific image. This could be a scene from our story, it could also be a logo of our organization, and this image would be scanned by the user, and that image will invoke a specific scene in our augmented reality story. Very similar to image tracking is face tracking. However, with face tracking, as you will see, very often this will prompt the device that we're using to switch to the selfie camera, and essentially the selfie camera, the front-facing camera, will scan our face and will use facial features such as our nose, eyes, mouth in order to place 3D objects, as you can see in this example here, for example, a pirate hat. The last type of tracking is in fact screen only. Whereas in this method, the user will interact with buttons that make up either a menu or a quiz. In the case of an AR story, for example, this is ideal for creating a quiz, for example, towards the end of the story. It should be noted that an AR story, an augmented reality story, can be made out of a mix and match in terms of the type of scenes. So that means that we can have a story. Typically, a story will have multiple scenes. Let's say a scene at the very beginning, a scene at the very end of the story, and in between one would have a number of scenes which portray the development of the story. Now, what is particularly useful to note here is that in a story we can have scenes with different types of tracking. So we can have scene 1 which uses words tracking, scene 2 that uses face tracking, and scene 3 that uses image tracking. Okay, so we can mix and match the tracking in a particular story. As I have already mentioned, the simplest, and I would suggest the first type of tracking that you should use, especially if you are new to this type of platform, is to use words tracking, because this requires the minimal intervention from your end and also from the end of the user. So I'm going to click on word tracking, and I'm going to select Start Creating. And this is where we are presented with the authoring platform itself. So this is where we are going to create the AR story itself. So first of all, let's have a look at the user interface itself. So we have in this project, or in this user interface, we have 5 key elements. We have a menu here, okay? We have a panel on the left-hand side, a panel on the right-hand side, a panel at the very bottom, and last but not least, we have an empty space here. So these are the 5 main elements that constitute our user interface. Okay, let's have a look at panel number 4, which is the panel at the bottom here. Okay, so in this panel here, we are going to use this toolbar in order to create multiple scenes. So right now we have one scene in our story. As I mentioned, typically in an AR story, we would have multiple scenes. And if we want to add a scene, all we need to do is click on the plus icon, which is either here or here. And this would, as you will notice, once again ask us about what type of tracking we wish to have. So this scene can have a face tracking, for example, an image tracking, it could be a menu. In our case, since this is our first tutorial, we're once again going to select words tracking and click on create scene. So as you notice, now we have 2 scenes, albeit these are empty scenes, but nevertheless we have 2 scenes that constitute our AR story. Now I'm going to go on to scene 1, okay, and I'm going to start to look a bit by bit through all the menus that we have. Now let's have a look at the menu on the left hand side. So essentially this menu is used in order to create assets. So I'm focusing on this menu here, and this menu is used to create assets or elements that will make up our story. So as you will notice, we can add a button, we can add text, we can add an image, we can add a video, or we can also add 3D assets. There are also some apps that can be connected, however, we will not go into this for the time being. So let's start by adding an image. So the first approach is to click on image, okay? I already have a number of items that I had already uploaded at the beginning prior to this tutorial. If you wish to add your own images, you can simply click on upload, and this will essentially ask you to look into a specific folder from where you wish to upload the image that you have. So I'm going to use an image that I had already uploaded, and in order to add it to this empty space, what we need to do is simply click and drag that object there. So as you will notice, I have already added an image there. If we want, we can add things like text, for example. So I'm going to click on Add Heading, and here I have added a piece of text. So we have added a text and an image. I would like to, before proceeding any further, I would like to spend some time to explain a bit the navigation, or how to navigate around this empty space. So this empty space, as you will see, we have a grid. It represents a surface, and here we have an empty three-dimensional space. Now, we can interact with this three-dimensional space. Now, it is particularly useful to have a physical mouse when you are using ZapWorks, because it makes your life a bit easier. Of course, you can use a trackpad, which you have on your laptops. However, it is much easier to have a physical mouse. We're going to make use of the left click button, right click button on our mouse, and as well as the scroll wheel. So if I click and hold the left mouse button and I move the cursor around, you will notice that I am essentially orbiting, moving around this empty space, or rather the space that we have where we have added a text and an image. So again, if I click the left mouse button and move around, essentially this allows me to orbit around the space that I have. If I click and hold the right mouse button, this allows me to pan around. So I can pan left to right, and I can also pan up and down. So these are essentially orbit and panning. We can pan upwards and downwards, left to right. The third and last button that can be useful is the scroll wheel. So if I scroll inwards or upwards, this essentially zooms in, and if I scroll backwards, this essentially zooms out. So again, I can orbit around, I can right click to pan upwards or downwards, left or right, and I can use the scroll wheel to zoom in or zoom out. You will notice also that there is a cube at the bottom right hand corner, and essentially these are called orthogonal views. So if I want to view my scene from the front, if I click on front, essentially this will orbit the scene so that I'm viewing exactly the items from the front. If I click on top, essentially I would be viewing my three-dimensional space from the very, very top. Usually, however, I would suggest using the left click and right click buttons as well as the scroll wheel in order to pan, orbit, and zoom in your three-dimensional space. Now, having covered this, it is worth noting that if we want to edit the text, all we need to do is double click on that text, okay, and essentially we can edit the text. So let's say cars tutorial 1, which is my text, and you will immediately notice you will have noticed that every time that I'm clicking either on the text or on the image, there are 3 arrows. So those 3 arrows are called a gizmo. And for the time being, I'm going to actually focus my attention on 3 very, very important buttons, which are the 3 buttons at the top part of this menu here. So the three buttons are collectively called transforms, okay? And these buttons will allow us to manipulate objects around our 3-dimensional space. So one thing that you are noticing right now is that the text and the image are on top of each other. It would be a good idea, therefore, to separate the text so that it is not an obstacle to the image. For this reason, we are going to use the first of the 3 commands, which is called the move command. And the move command, as the name implies, allows us to move things around. So I'm going to select the text, and if you will notice, we have 3 arrows. If I want to move the text left or right, all I need to do is grab the red arrow, click and hold, and this essentially moves the arrow, or rather the text, horizontally, either to the left or to the right. If I want to move the text upwards, I can do the same exact thing, and I can move it upwards or downwards using the corresponding green arrow. If I want to move, now I have rotated a bit, if I want to move the text forwards or backwards in my scene, all I need to do is grab, click and hold the blue arrow, and this will move the text towards the front or towards the very, very back. So as you can see, using the move command, which is here, these 3 arrows can be used to manipulate the position of any assets that I have. Again, I can do this in the same way with the image. Now, I would like to point out something which is very, very important. Let's have a look at the menu, which is on the right-hand side. You will notice the term transforms, and more importantly, the first item that I would like to mention is this set of coordinates. So in ZapWorks, we make use of what is called the Cartesian coordinate system, whereas the position of any object is determined by 3 coordinates: the x coordinate, the y coordinate, and the z coordinate. Now, notice what happens to these 3 numbers when I move them around. So if, for example, I move the text that I have towards the left or the right hand side, you'll notice that the first number in the position coordinate is changing. If I move it more to the left, it becomes more negative. If I move it to the right, the number not only changes but also becomes positive. Same thing with the y coordinates. If you notice, the y is green, which corresponds to the green arrow here. If I move this upwards, again, the value changes and becomes a higher positive number. If I move it downwards, it becomes a smaller positive number, or even if I take it below my surface, it becomes a negative number. So I'm going to move it upwards here. Okay. Same thing with the z-axis. So if I move this forwards, the z value here becomes more positive, or even if I move it backwards, it becomes more negative. I am underscoring this point because we can also change the position essentially by changing the values directly. So if I change this to -40, you will notice that this has moved slightly from the left to the right. If I change the y value, if I want to shift it upwards, the text upwards, if I change it to 50, essentially this has shifted to a position which is -40, 50, and let's call this minus 40. So we can change the position either by manipulating these three arrows or by simply inputting coordinates which correspond to the position of this asset, which is a text. This same thing, okay, applies for this principle applies for any item that we have, even if it is an image. Now, I would like to shift our attention to the second important element, which is the scale command. Now, you'll notice that in our case, the logo of the project is quite small. So one thing that I would like to do is to enlarge a bit the logo. So something that we can do is essentially to click on the logo, select the scale command, and what we're going to do, by clicking and dragging, we can make the logo larger or even smaller. You will notice that this time round, what is changing is in fact what are called the size coordinates, which are these coordinates here. Okay, so you'll notice that as I change or I drag around, the size coordinates are changing. You will also notice that in this particular case, okay, we have a third coordinate which is switched off. In fact, this is grayed out and is not changing. Why is this the case? Because right now we have an image, and an image is a two-dimensional asset. Okay, so it has a width and it has a height, but it has no depth. So right now we cannot change the depth of an image because an image is a two-dimensional object. So this provides us with a good opportunity to add another item. So far we have added a text, we have added an image. Something else that we can add is also a three-dimensional object. So I'm going on 3D model here on the left-hand side. I'm going to browse the library of assets that I have, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to search for an asset, and in my case I'm going to use this robot. I'm going to select it, and right now you will notice that we have added a three-dimensional object, okay, because it has a width, a depth, and a height. So for the time being, I'm going to move it around, okay. Actually, I'm also going to add another asset, let's say another 3D model, and I'm going to look for something else, let's say maybe a tree. So again, these are models. Some of them are provided by default through ZapWorks. Others I have found and uploaded myself. We will cover how to find 3D models and upload them in subsequent tutorials. So I'm currently looking for an asset which represents a tree. This is the tree that I have, and I'm going to select that file. And I'm going to move this around. As you will notice, these assets that I have added have a width, a height, and also a depth. So if you notice now, if I click on the robot and I add the scale command, or so I use the scale command, you'll notice that I have the gizmo which consists of three axes. So we have a width, a height, and a depth. And I can scale the object, I can make it larger or smalling depending on what I want. Something that is important to note is what is called the aspect ratio. So you will notice that here I have a chain. Okay, it is a small icon, but it is a very, very important icon to note. So this chain link essentially is what logs the aspect ratio. Now, what this does is that it makes sure that the width and height and depth of our object are logged in the same proportion to each other. So that means, in practice, that whenever I increase the height, the width and the depth are changing accordingly. Now, if I, for some reason, want to stretch the object, that is, make it longer without changing its depth and width, what I would need to do is to unlock the aspect ratio. And the effect of this is that I can actually make the object taller without changing its width or depth. So in effect, what I am doing is essentially I am stretching my object. I'm going to click on a button here, which is the undo button, because in essence, I would strongly recommend that the aspect ratio is kept logged. In most cases, you do not need to stretch an object, but you want to keep the same proportion. So again, this is the scale command. Now you will notice that every time I'm changing the scale of the object that I have, the object is going through the grid. Remember, the grid represents our floor. So a very convenient button that we can use is in fact this snap to surface button, which is this button here. And this always makes sure, or it ensures, that the object is always on the ground. So right now, our robot is going, the feet of our robot, as you can see, are going through the ground. But if I click on the snap to surface, the feet of the robot are essentially, on the ground. The same applies for any other 3D model. If I make this tree smaller, you will notice that it becomes elevated from the ground. But if I click on snap to surface, the tree goes back on the ground. So I'm going to change the proportions of the 3D objects that I have here. Okay, I'm going to snap this to the ground and snap this to the ground in order to make the relative proportion of the tree and the robot make more sense. So as you can see, we have gradually started to build things bit by bit. So far we have only populated scene 1. Okay, we remember that we have another scene which is called scene 2 in our story, which is still empty, but we will populate that soon. I'm going to add another asset, again another 3D model in my case, and I'm going to look for another character which is part of my story, which is going to be this monster here. So again, we have our character here. Okay, I can move this backwards. Let me just move this upwards. I can move this backwards to the left and right. Okay, I will make this monster a bit larger and we'll use the snap to surface command. The last transform that we have not covered yet is in fact the orbit command. This will make sure that we can rotate objects around their own axes. So for instance, if I click on the monster and select the orbit command, you will notice that there are 3 circles. Each circle represents a rotation around the x-axis, around the y-axis, and around the z-axis. So if I want to make the monster look towards the direction of the small robot, I will basically select the green circle, click and drag, and as you will notice, I am rotating the monster or this character around the y-axis. Notice that the y value here changes accordingly. So again, if I rotate this, you'll notice that the y value, in this case, those numbers represent degrees, are changing. Okay, so if I type this 0, it will take us back to the original orientation. If I type in 270 degrees, the monster would have turned by 90 degrees in the clockwise direction. Okay, but again, it's more convenient probably to use these handles. We can also orient the monster or rotate the monster around the x-axis as well as the z-axis. But for the time being, okay, we're going to simply reset the x rotation to 0 and the z rotation to 0, because all we need to do is change the orientation of the monster around the y-axis. So again, as you can see, we are starting to add things. So these are three very important what are called transform commands, and they are useful to change the position, size, and orientation of any object that we have, be it text, an image, or even a 3D model. Now, what if we want to create copies of assets that we already have here? So, a very useful button is to use the duplicate command. Essentially, every time I have an item or object that is selected, okay, every time I select an object and click on the duplicate, essentially, this will create an exact copy of that item. Again, if I, for example, select the robot, change its orientation, and select duplicate, it will essentially create an exact and perfect copy of that object. If we want to delete an object in our scene, all we need to do is we can simply click on the bin here or simply press delete. I'm going to click on the bin here, and as you can see now, that object or that 3D model has been deleted. Something which is worth noting is that we can copy things or assets from one scene to another. So this is a useful shortcut. If I select an object, press Ctrl C, okay, on a Windows machine, and I go on scene 2 and press Ctrl V, you will notice that this character has been copied and pasted from scene 1 to scene 2 in its orientation. So we want to copy an object with its orientation from one scene to another. All we need to do is select that object, press Ctrl C, and then go onto the scene where we want to paste our object and press Ctrl V. So this is our second scene in our story. Again, I can start adding other items. Okay, for example, let's say in the story there is, let's say, a treasure chest or some other asset. Again, I can add items from here, from my 3D library, and again, I can start to arrange things using the transform commands. So we go back to scene 1 for the time being. Something which is very important to note is that we have in the top menu here another command, which is the lock command. What is the purpose of the lock command? Well, in essence, if we have an object and we do not want to mistakenly change its orientation, size, or position, we can use the lock command in order to freeze the transforms corresponding to that object. So you will notice that right now, if we look on the menu on the right-hand side, I can change the size, position, or rotation by inputting values here. However, you'll notice that as soon as I click on the lock command, these three items, okay, the size coordinates, the position coordinates, as well as the rotation coordinates, these three commands essentially become grayed out. And I am no longer able to edit, okay, to manipulate or change the size, position, or rotation. As a matter of fact, okay, if I try to select the robot, okay, and try to drag it around, I am not successful. I cannot change its position, change its scale, or even change its rotation. So again, this is particularly useful if we want to fix the position, size, and orientation of an element that we have. If we do not want to do that, we simply click on unlock, and once again we can change the transforms of that particular asset. Another command which is useful in this top toolbar here is the recenter. The recenter is essentially useful if we want to reset to the default view. So right now I am viewing my scene from this orientation. If I want to recenter, all I need to do is click recenter, and it will take me back to the original orientation. I should also mention that the menu on the right hand side, okay, has several sub-menus. For example, right now I have chosen a text that I had created earlier, okay, and if I, for example, want to change the font of my text, on the right-hand menu, there is a text sub-menu where basically I can change the text itself, but I am also able to change things like, for example, the font, the type of font that I have, as well as things like the color of the font, as well as the size of the font. I can use, by the way, the scale command in order to make the text fit into one or several lines. So this is essentially the menu on the right hand side is a properties menu, and it will change, the sub-menus will change depending on what you have selected. Okay, so these are essentially the main menus that we have. So we have the menu on the left hand side that is used to create or add assets. The menu at the top, where the first part is used to move things around. We can copy and paste things, we can lock and unlock items, we can delete items, we can recenter our view, and if we have objects which are elevated in air, we can simply use the snap to surface in order to put them onto our hypothetical ground. Now, for this tutorial, I'm going to spend the remaining few minutes that we have on two important commands. So the first command is in fact this one here, and the second command is in fact this one here. So I have highlighted the two commands which will be the center of our attention for the time being. So let's focus on the first command that we have. So for the first command, okay, essentially this command is what are called layers. So essentially, by clicking on that icon there, it will reveal all the objects that we have in this particular scene. If I hover on top of an object, you will notice that I can lock, okay, I can lock or unlock the transforms related to that object. For example, I can lock the transforms related to the monster, but something which is important is the hide or visible or invisible command, which is represented by this icon here, which is an eye. If I click on the eye, the monster character has vanished. Now, please note that that character has not been deleted, i.e., it has not been removed from the scene, but rather it has been made invisible. Now, you might wonder, what is the purpose of this? Well, as you will see in the next couple of tutorials, we can add interactivity in our AR story. And one way to make things interactive is to create instances where items or assets, such as 3D models in our story, become visible or invisible when, for example, a user taps on them. So by default right now, the monster is invisible. I can create an interaction whereby when the user taps on a button, for example, or taps on a particular area of the screen, the monster becomes invisible. So this is a layer which is good to know. Why? Because it reveals all the items that we have in our scene, including items that are not visible on the screen. Now, the second important element that I would like to focus upon is in fact this element. Right now you'll see there is this icon here which says AR / and an icon of a smartphone. So right now we are in a mode which is called AR mode. If I click on and toggle to screen relative mode, you will notice that all of a sudden we have a preview of how the story would look like through a screen. In fact, you'll notice that on the right-hand side, we have several models of phones, several different models of phones. For example, I can change to a Pixel 6a. And what is changing is essentially the ratio and dimensions of the screen. For example, if I use an iPad, you'll notice that the screen is horizontal and the dimensions of the screen are, of course, larger. Now, very often, if we are creating a story, we need to provide a means so that the user shifts or progresses from one scene to another. So, for example, in this tutorial, we have two scenes. And we need to provide a way for the user to go from scene 1 to scene 2. Very often, we will make use of buttons. However, it is important that the buttons, that is the navigation buttons, are added using this mode, which is called the screen relative mode. So why is this important? This is important because we want to make sure that the buttons that we have are visible to the user irrespective of the model of device that the user is using. So we want to make sure that whether the user has a Samsung phone, a Xiaomi phone, or some other model, we want to make sure that the navigational buttons are always visible. So what we're going to do is this. I'm going to use, let's say, an iPhone 8 ratio. I'm going to add a button. By clicking on the button, I'm going to simply select a button here. I'm going to click and drag here. And for the time being, I'm going to call this button Next. So the intent is that when the user taps on this button, it will take the user from scene 1 to the next scene, which is scene 2. As always, we can change things like the color, the font, etc., etc. But the main point here is to go on transforms, and you'll notice this area here. So I would like to shift my attention to this part here of the user interface. So this, under transforms, we have what is called anchor to screen edge. And what I'm going to do, I want to make sure that the button, the next button, is always located on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. So no matter the size of the screen, the button that I have created is always going to be located on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. In fact, notice what happens. For example, if I change the model of the phone, for example, if I change from an iPhone to an iPad, you'll notice that the button, despite the fact that the phone has a portrait mode and the tablet is in landscape mode, the button has shifted its position so that it is always located on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. So this is very, very important because, of course, different users will use different devices. Now, the button that I have added, first of all, you'll notice that we have a new layer here on the left-hand side. We have a new layer, which is called the screen layer, which corresponds to the screen relative mode. And in this new layer, we have a button, which is called, of course, the next button, which has been added under the screen layer. If we shift back to AR layer, you'll notice that the button has vanished. This does not mean that the button is in there, but the button belongs to the screen layer, and it will only become visible when we click on the screen relative mode. Now, the button right now is a dummy button. What do I mean by this? Well, this means that the button on its own doesn't do anything. It is a button which basically doesn't do anything. So if I click on the button, I want to create what is called an action, which is located, if we look at the menu here, on the right-hand side, we have actions. And the action that I want, as I have already mentioned, is that when the user taps on the next button, it will take us from scene 1 to scene 2. And this is where we're going to add a new action. So I'm going to, with the button highlighted, I'm going to go on Actions, click Add New Action, select Action Set, and in this case, you'll see the possibility of things that can happen. For example, a sound can be played. When tapping the button, the AR experience will take the user to a particular web page that you can specify. But for the time being, all we want is to link to a scene. And the scene that we want the button to link us to is the next scene, which is scene number 2. So essentially, this button will link to scene 2. And whenever the user clicks on this button, it will take us to scene number 2. Now, in the same sense, scene 2 does not have a button right now. Why? Because we did not add a button. So I'm going to add another button. I'm going to place this button on the bottom left-hand side. So I'm going to click on Transforms and anchor it on the bottom left-hand side. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to name this button as back. So I will type in back, because the intent is for this button, when the user is on screen 2 and taps back, it will take us back to scene number 1. So with the button highlighted, I will go on Actions, click Add New Action, okay, select Links to Scene, and in our case, we want this button to link to scene number 1. So now we have added our very simple and rudimentary story. We have added a menu whereby the user, if the user taps next, it will take us to scene number 2. And when the user is on scene number 2 and taps back, it will take us to back to scene number 1. So this is a very important part of creating a story, which is essentially creating a means for the user to interact and navigate from one scene to another of the augmented reality story. Again, if we click on AR, the buttons and the preview will disappear. However, if you want to check whether the button is still there, if you go on the layer and check here, you'll notice that there is a button called Next under the screen layer. So despite the fact that the button is not visible, it is under screen layer. And we can preview that button by clicking on, again, the screen relative mode. So this is essentially a wrap-up of our first tutorial. Before finishing this tutorial, I would like to mention two last important commands. If we wish to preview our story, to temporarily preview our story, we can click on the preview command, and this will generate a temporary QR code, which you can use in order to test whether or not, for example, the scenes are loading correctly. But if you want to make your story public, all you need to do is click on Publish. And if you recall at the very beginning, we had decided to create two triggers. That is, we decided that the story would be made shareable either through a link, which is provided here, or else through a QR code, which is listed here. So this is essentially the end of our tutorial. I hope you have found this interesting. The tutorial will also be made available through our website, which is carsproject.eu. Last but not least, I should mention that our next tutorial will focus more on the actions and behavior that can be used to add interactions in augmented reality scenes, as well as we will look at specific examples of target images that are used for tracking, and we will also look at an AR story Okay, so in the next tutorial, you will get an example of what an augmented reality story would look like. Thank you once again for following this tutorial.